A geopolitical crisis is brewing in paradise. The island nation of the Maldives has become a major flashpoint in the region amid rising tension between China and India.
The latest turmoil comes after the country's president had opposition leaders and Supreme Court judges arrested. The situation turned into a significant global problem when the country's former and exiled president called on India to send troops to the island to restore order and limit China's influence in the country. Here to walk us through it is Alex Kliment. He's a CBSN contributor and signal writer for G0 Media and part of a new partnership between CBS News and G0 Media, a Eurasia Group company. It is a mouthful. We do it every time we have you on the show, Alex.
Twice a week.
Next week we'll do it on Friday, too. So this is a real fascinating what's happening in the Maldives, because it's a small country, which is generally an island paradise. I've been there 3 or 4 times. It's wonderful. But now that China and India are getting involved, it's having geopolitical concerns.
Yeah, so the political crisis that you just described basically boils down to a friction between the current president, Abdul Yameen, and the former president, Mohammed Nasheed, who has been exiled and is leading the opposition that the current president is cracking down on. It got interesting from a geopolitical perspective when the exiled president called on India to intervene to sort out the crisis. And the backstory here is that since taking power in 2013, the current president, Abdul Yameen, has turned the island dramatically towards China economically, right? The Maldives have historically been within what India sees as its own sphere of influence. Yameen has taken it dramatically towards China, courting infrastructure investments, signing free trade agreements, and so on. And so the Indians, of course, don't like that, right? They see the Maldives as their sphere of influence. And the question is, over time, how much does this kind of little flashpoint in the Maldives reflect a broader contest for influence in the Indian Ocean? The Chinese are building ports and rails in all of the countries that are on the Indian Ocean around India. The Indians don't like it. That's one of the big geopolitical rivalries we'll see in Asia in the coming years.
This is a conversation that comes up over and over again when we talk about the America First policy, and if America pulls back, then who takes its place? Right. And China is increasingly being seen as the country that's interested in that. I can understand why the Maldives would be interested in China. They're getting a lot. But why is China interested in this small little group of islands?
So from China's perspective, it's part of a broader attempt to kind of expand their commercial and logistical influence in the Indian Ocean. From China's perspective, it's a no-brainer, right? 2/3 of China's oil exports cross those shipping lanes, hugely important for China's commerce. From China's perspective, it's a no-brainer. From India's perspective, it's an encroachment. And the countries involved are kind of caught in the middle, right? The Sri Lankans recently had to give over control of a Chinese port to China once they were too indebted to pay off the loans that China had given them to build it, and so on. So the bigger question is, does China start to extract some kind of geopolitical influence as a result of pumping all this money into infrastructure in these countries?
And I imagine with China, because the islands are small, it doesn't take a lot of money to make a big difference. So you can build a small port, you can build better roads. It's simple. They don't have a lot of roads.
Most of these islands are, in fact, very, very small. And usually on most of the islands, there is just a resort.
Right.
And the people who work there, who live in Mali, the capital, are either they take a boat or they take a plane, a seaplane, to get to these islands. What's fascinating is if we throw up that map again, where we see where the Maldives is situated in the center of the Indian Ocean, India obviously suggests that this is their sphere of influence. But what China is doing, as you point out, is they're able to free up some shipping lanes to get oil wherever they need to get oil. And critically, the U.S. military tells me, military influence. In other words, if you have a stronghold, if you have a foothold on an island in the Maldives, you can launch aircraft from there. You can refuel your tankers and your battleships.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things is to think there's a kind of historical comparison here, right? After World War II, the United States expanded its commercial influence on the back of naval bases that had been set up during the war. What the Chinese are doing now is somewhat the opposite, right? They're expanding commercial and logistical influence through Belt and Road, through other infrastructure investments that over time is going to take on a strategic dimension, right? Who is going to defend $1 trillion worth of ports and rails expanding across Asia, right? So as the Chinese move, it's not just the Maldives, right? It's the Chinese building ports in Pakistan, in Bangladesh. They're building rail in Nepal. These are all countries that are around India, right? Someone's going to have to defend those commercial assets over time, and the question is who? And the story of the U.S. kind of withdrawing from global power is a big one, right? The Chinese have done very well as a result of U.S. provision of security on the high seas, right? China depends on trade. Trade depends on maritime security. Maritime security depends, for the past 70 years, on the U.S. Navy. Now the Chinese are starting to try and see ways in which they can expand their own influence, and maybe they start to take on a strategic dimension over time as well.
Speaking of the U.S., any reaction from the U.S.?
Well, the U.S. has condemned the current president of the Maldives' crackdown on the opposition, but so far is not taking any further action. And the Indians, by the way, aren't going to send troops into the Maldives, right?
Because that's the follow-up. I mean, how far could this go? I mean, can we see some sort of military action?
Well, the Maldives are relatively small. I mean, the Chinese and Indians are not going to risk a war over the Maldives. Also, the Indians are in a kind of delicate position here, right? Because this isn't a democratically elected government, right? India doesn't want to be seen to be sending troops in to undermine a democratically elected government. So I think the story is less about what happens in the Maldives specifically, but more about what it reflects more globally about this contest for influence.
Well, it is also
China.
interesting to point out that the Maldives is Muslim. India is obviously predominantly Hindu, although they're Muslims obviously that live in India. They've always been, their mortal enemies are the Pakistanis, a Muslim country. It's just fascinating. And I sort of, my take on the U.S. position should be the U.S. should not turn a blind eye, even though it's far away. And in most Americans' minds, it doesn't matter. There are more pressing issues here at home and closer. But this is a very similar strategy to the one that the Japanese employed before the start of World War II, where they went around in Southeast Asia and in East Asia, grabbing small countries, Singapore, Hong Kong, other places, and suggesting this is their sphere of influence, and ultimately we know what happened and we know how that ends.